In this episode of Dark Crime Story, we uncover the chilling stories of those executed in the month of March, diving into their crimes, last words, and final meals before meeting their fate. One such case is that of Brad Sigman, executed by firing squad, a method not used in the U.S. for 15 years. Sigman's story began in early 2001, when his 3-year relationship with Rebecca Barbar ended. Unable to accept her decision, he began stalking her, desperate for reconciliation. The night before his crime, he confided in a friend, Eugene Strobe, revealing his plan to break into her family home, tie up her parents, and force her to speak with him. Strobe refused to be involved, but Sigman moved forward, alone. The next morning, he broke into the Lark residence and brutally attacked David and Gladys Lark with a baseball bat, striking them repeatedly in the head until they died. He then stole David's gun and waited for Rebecca to return home. Upon her arrival, he held her at gunpoint, forcing her into his car with the intent to drive her to North Carolina. However, she leapt from the moving vehicle in a desperate bid for freedom. Though Sigman fired at her, she managed to escape and was later hospitalized. A massive manhunt followed, and after 11 days on the run, Sigman was captured in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, before being extradited to South Carolina. His trial began on July 18, 2002, and the prosecution wasted no time presenting overwhelming evidence, including the murder weapon used to bludgeon David and Gladys Lark. That same day, the jury sentenced him to death. As the verdict was read, Sigman's mother wept uncontrollably, while Rebecca Barbar watched in silence. Sigman himself locked eyes with her one last time before being led away. For 23 years, Sigman sat on death row, filing numerous appeals, all of which were denied. When his execution date was finally set for March 7th, 2025, he was given the choice between lethal injection and firing squad. Citing concerns over botched lethal injections, Sigman opted for the firing squad. South Carolina had spent $54,000 constructing a firing squad chamber, which featured bulletproof glass, a drainage system for blood collection, and a wall to conceal the executioners. The decision reignited controversy, as no South Carolina governor had granted clemency since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. As the day approached, Sigman requested his last meal, 3 buckets of KFC's original recipe chicken, intending to share with his fellow inmates. His request was denied, and instead he was served 4 pieces of fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. On March 7th, 2025, Sigman was strapped into a specially designed chair, a hood placed over his head, and a target pinned to his chest, marking the execution site. 3 prison staff volunteers took their positions behind a concealed wall, rifles loaded with live ammunition. At the warden's command, they fired simultaneously, striking Sigman directly in the heart. Witnesses described the moment as instantaneous, though the sound of the gunfire was chilling. One witness recounted, when the shots were fired, the room flinched. The bullets were so precisely grouped, it was horrifying. Sigman was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m. In his final words, Sigman quoted 4 Bible passages, arguing that the New Testament does not grant man the authority to execute another. Through his attorney, he left a statement urging his fellow Christians to fight against the death penalty, stating, "Now we are under God's grace and mercy." His lawyer, Gerald Bo King, who witnessed the execution, called it horrible and violent, condemning South Carolina for carrying out a bloody spectacle in 2025. Meanwhile, Rebecca Armstrong, Sigman's former girlfriend and the daughter of his victims, spoke publicly for the first time in 24 years. Though acknowledging the devastation Sigman caused her family, she expressed opposition to his execution, stating, "Life imprisonment should have been enough. Death is something only God should decide. Was this justice or state-sanctioned revenge?" Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Aaron Brian Gunches, executed on March 19th, 2025. On March 19th, 2025, Aaron Brian Gunches was executed by lethal injection at Florence State Prison in Arizona, marking the end of a decades-long legal battle. His crimes date back to November 14th, 2002, when he kidnapped and murdered Ted Price in Mesa, Arizona. Gunches had initially forced Price into his car, claiming he would take him to a bus station. However, upon realizing he didn't have money for a ticket, Gunches instead drove him to a remote desert area along the Beeline Highway. There, he shot Price 4 times, leaving him for dead. 2 months later, on January 15th, 2003, Gunches encountered an Arizona public safety officer at a traffic checkpoint. Rather than complying, he opened fire, shooting twice before speeding away. This sparked a high-speed chase involving more than 50 officers, ultimately leading to his capture the next day, hiding in a barn in Wendell, Arizona. In 2004, Gunches pleaded guilty to murder, and by 2008, he was sentenced to death. Unusually, he repeatedly requested his own execution, even criticizing the state for delaying it. Despite his initial execution date being set for April 6th, 2023, legal proceedings postponed it until March 19th, 2025. One day before his execution, Gunches was offered a last meal, which included a double Western-style burger, spicy gyros, onion rings, and baklava. At 10:30 a.m., he was strapped to the gurney, and the lethal injection process began. By 10:33 a.m., he was declared dead. What do you think? Did Arizona grant his final wish, or was this a troubling execution? Share your thoughts below. Jessie D. Hoffman Jr., executed on March 18th, 2025. On March 18th, 2025, Jessie D. Hoffman Jr. was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at Louisiana State Penitentiary, marking another controversial use of this relatively new execution method. Hoffman's crimes date back to November 26, 1996, when the 18-year-old kidnapped 28-year-old Murphy-Elliott, an advertising executive in downtown New Orleans. After forcing her to withdraw money from an ATM, he drove her to a remote area in St. Tammany Parish, where he assaulted and ultimately took her life. His arrest led to a trial where a jury swiftly found him guilty, and on September 11th, 1998, he was sentenced to death for first-degree murder. Over the decades, Hoffman filed numerous appeals, but all were ultimately denied. When the day of execution arrived, Hoffman declined to give a final statement and chose not to request a special last meal. At 6:12 p.m., he was escorted into the execution chamber, where prison officials secured him to the chair and fitted a nitrogen mask over his face. The gas was released, and for the next 19 minutes, Hoffman remained inside the chamber. Witnesses reported convulsive movements before he finally became still. At 6:50 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. A state official later confirmed that his body reacted similarly to the first known execution by nitrogen hypoxia, raising concerns about the humaneness of the method. Edward James, executed on March 20th, 2025. On March 20th, 2025, Florida and Oklahoma carried out back-to-back executions of 2 convicted killers, Edward James and Wendell Gom, both sentenced to death for heinous crimes committed decades earlier. On September 20th, 1993, Edward James returned home from a party and encountered 9-year-old Toni Nooner asleep in his living room. He attacked her, leaving her unconscious before taking her to another room where he assaulted her. Tragically, she did not survive her injuries. James then turned his violence toward Elizabeth Betty Dick, the grandmother of the children, attacking her with a blunt object and a knife. Her granddaughter, Wendy, heard the commotion and entered the room, only for James to restrain her before fleeing. His case gained national attention after being featured on America's Most Wanted, leading to his capture on October 6, 1993, at an unemployment office in Bakersfield, California. In 1995, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and kidnapping, receiving a death sentence. Edward James was scheduled to die at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison, but an unexplained 2-hour delay postponed his execution. When finally brought to the chamber, James declined to give a final statement. However, at sentencing, he once admitted, "I don't want to die, but I believe it's the right punishment for what I did. From now until I'm executed, I'm just going to exist, accepting as much as possible what I've done." At 8:15 p.m., after receiving a lethal injection, he was declared dead. Witnesses reported that James struggled to breathe, briefly curled his arms, and then fell still. Wendell Gom, executed on March 20th, 2025. On November 2005, in Blaine County, Oklahoma, Wendell Gom and his accomplice, John Owens, were drinking whiskey and planning a burglary when they randomly selected a home to break into. Inside, they encountered Drew Kopp, who was home with his 2 daughters and their friend, Amber Matthews. When Kopp tried to reason with them, Gom shot him in the head, killing him instantly. Amber Matthews, 23, attempted to flee with a baby, but Gom shot her in the back of the head and again in the forehead, ensuring she wouldn't survive. Gom and Owens fled the scene, but were arrested shortly after at a convenience store. At trial, Owens received life without parole, while Gom was sentenced to death for first-degree murder and attempted murder. Grom's final meal consisted of a supreme pizza with Canadian bacon, half a liter of vanilla ice cream, half a liter of Coca-Cola. His execution took place hours before Edward James at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In his final words, Gom apologized to the victims' families. "I deeply regret what I did, not just because it brought me here, but because I can't even imagine the trauma, pain, and suffering I caused. It saddens me to see so much hatred in your hearts, because I am not the person the state of Oklahoma has portrayed me to be." At 11:05 a.m., after receiving a lethal injection, he was declared dead. William Lacroy Jr., Georgia, executed on September 22, 2020. On October 7th, 2001, the quiet town of Cherry Log, Georgia, was shattered by a horrifying crime. Joanne Lee Tassler, a 30-year-old nurse, was brutally attacked in her own home. William Lacroy Jr., a former soldier and registered sex offender, had been lying in wait. After breaking into her house while she was away, Lacroy tied Tassler up with wires, assaulted her, and stabbed her repeatedly before fleeing the scene in his black 1996 Ford Explorer. The police quickly zeroed in on Lacroy as their prime suspect. Not only did he live nearby, but he had also been spotted spying on Tassler with binoculars in the days leading up to the attack. Lacroy's extensive criminal record, which included theft and child abuse, only deepened the suspicions. Shockingly, he had been released from federal prison just a month before the crime. On October 11th, 2001, Lacroy's run from the law came to an end. Border Patrol agents apprehended him in Minnesota as he tried to cross into Canada with the stolen vehicle. During his arrest, Lacroy confessed in chilling detail to the crime, even claiming he had mistaken Tassler for someone from his past. In 2004, Lacroy was convicted in federal court for carjacking resulting in death, a crime punishable by the death penalty. His defense argued that the murder wasn't premeditated and that he shouldn't be tried at the federal level. However, the prosecution proved that Lacroy had meticulously planned the crime, even purchasing the cables he used to bind his victim. On March 10, 2004, he was sentenced to death. As his execution date approached, Lacroy was offered a last meal. His initial request for KFC was denied due to security concerns over the bones, so he settled for Pizza Hut. On September 22, 2020, William Lacroy Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. His execution marked the sixth carried out by the federal government that year. When asked for his last words, Lacroy remained silent, closing his eyes as the lethal injection took effect. He was pronounced dead at 9:06 p.m. Christopher Valva, Texas, executed on September 24, 2020. On June 21, 1999, in Fort Hood, Texas, 19-year-old Christopher Valva and 4 accomplices committed a crime that would haunt their community. The group targeted Todd and Stacy Bagley, a couple from Iowa, at a gas station. Under the guise of needing a ride, they forced the Bagleys into their own car at gunpoint. The couple was locked in the trunk for hours as their captors withdrew money from their accounts and stole their belongings. Later, in a remote area, Valva ordered the car's interior to be doused with flammable liquid as the Bagleys pleaded for their lives, even singing "Jesus Loves Me." Valva shot them both in the head. Stacy was still alive when his accomplice, Brandon Bernard, set the car on fire. The couple's lives were tragically cut short. Valva and Bernard were arrested days later and sentenced to death in 2000 under federal jurisdiction as the crime occurred on military land. 3 other minors involved received prison sentences. On September 24, 2020, Christopher Valva was executed by lethal injection at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. His last meal request, a pepperoni pizza from Pizza Hut and a soda, was granted. In his final moments, Valva expressed remorse, saying, "I am more than the worst thing I've done. Change is possible if people want it. I'm ready, Father." He was pronounced dead at 6:42 p.m., Orlando Hall, Texas, executed on November 19, 2020, in the mid-1990s.
As his execution date approached, Lacroy was offered a last meal. His initial request for KFC was denied due to security concerns over the bones, so he settled for Pizza Hut. On September 22, 2020, William Lacroy Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. His execution marked the 6th carried out by the federal government that year. When asked for his last words, Lacroy remained silent, closing his eyes as the lethal injection took effect.
3 days later,
he was pronounced
broke
dead
into their
at 9:06
apartment with
p.m.
Webster, Demetrius Hall, and Beckley.
Christopher
When they
Valva,
didn't find
Texas,
the men,
executed
they
on
kidnapped
September
their
24,
16-year-old
2020.
sister,
On
Lisa
June 21,
Renee.
1999,
During the
in
drive
Fort
back
Hood,
to
Texas,
Arkansas,
19-year-old
the group
Christopher
subjected
Valva and
Lisa
4
to
accomplices committed a
unspeakable
crime
abuse.
that would haunt
To
their
ensure
community.
she could never
The
testify
group targeted
against
Todd
them,
and Stacy
they struck
Bagley,
her
a
with
couple from
shovel
Iowa,
and
at a gas
buried
station.
her alive.
Under the guise of
crime
needing a ride,
was a
they
stark
forced the
reminder
Bagleys
of the
into their
brutality
own car
that
at
can arise
gunpoint.
from greed
The couple was
and
locked in the
vengeance.
trunk for hours
Orlando
as their
Hall's
captors
story
withdrew money
is one
from
of
their accounts and
darkness
stole their
despair.
belongings.
A tragic example of how lives can be destroyed
Later,
by
in a remote
violence
area,
and retribution.
Valva ordered the car's
His
interior to be
actions left
doused
a
with
lasting
flammable liquid.
scar on
As the
community
Bagleys pleaded
and
for their
served as
lives,
a grim
even singing
reminder of
Jesus
the
Loves Me,
consequences
Valva
of a
shot them
life
both in the head.
steeped in
Stacy
crime.
was still
3 days
alive when
after
his
the
accomplice,
abduction of
Brandon
16-year-old
Bernard, set the
Lisa
car on
Renee,
fire. The couple's
Orlando
lives were
Hall,
tragically cut short.
Demetrius Hall, and Stephen Beckley were arrested.
Valva and Bernard were
Orlando
arrested days later and
confessed to his
sentenced to death in
involvement in the
2000
crime,
under federal
revealing
jurisdiction
the horrifying
as the crime occurred on
details of how
military
they had
land.
kidnapped,
3 other minors
abused,
involved received
and
prison
ultimately
sentences.
suffocated
On September
Lisa
24,
in a
2020,
car. The case
Christopher
quickly
Valva was
escalated to
executed by
federal
lethal injection
jurisdiction due
at the
to the
Terre
crossing
Haute
of state
Penitentiary in
lines,
Indiana.
drawing
His last meal
national
request,
attention.
a pepperoni pizza
Orlando
from Pizza Hut
Hall
and a
and
soda,
Bruce
was
Webster
granted.
were charged
In his final
with
moments,
kidnapping,
Valva expressed
resulting in
remorse,
death,
saying, "I am
among other
more than the
crimes,
worst thing I've done.
and both
Change is
faced
possible
the
if people
death
want it.
penalty.
I'm ready, Father."
In
He was pronounced
1995,
dead at 6:42
Orlando
p.m.
was found guilty and sentenced to death.
Orlando Hall,
also
Texas.
received a death
He was executed on
sentence,
November
but his
19,
conviction was
2020.
overturned
In the
2019
mid-1990s, Orlando Hall,
due to
Bruce
evidence of
Webster,
intellectual
and Marvin Holloway
disability.
ran a
On
drug
November
trafficking ring in
19th,
Arkansas,
2020,
with Stephen Beckley transporting
Orlando
marijuana
Hall
from
was
Texas.
executed
On
by
September
lethal
21,
injection at the
1994,
Terre Haute
Hall traveled to
Penitentiary
Texas for a
in
drug deal
Indiana.
with Neil
In his
Renee
final
and
moments,
Stanfield Vitalis,
Hall,
who swindled
had
him out of
converted to Islam,
$4,700.
offered his
Consumed
last
by
words.
rage,
I
Hall tracked down the
invite everyone
scammers and
to
3 days
Islam.
later broke into
Thank
their
you for
apartment
giving
with
me the
Webster,
opportunity
Demetrius
to
Hall,
forgive.
and Beckley.
Take care. Tell my children I love them. He was
When they didn't
pronounced
find the
dead
men,
at
they
11:47
kidnapped their
p.m.
16-year-old sister,
What are your
Lisa
thoughts
Renee.
on these
During the drive back to
executions?
Arkansas,
Did
the group
justice
subjected
prevail,
Lisa to
or was there
unspeakable
another
abuse.
way?
To ensure
Let us
she
know
could
in
never
the
testify
comments.
against them, they